5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
Hey, space enthusiasts. Space traffic management and related space debris continue to be hot topics as we keep on hearing about satellites like SpaceX's Starlink having to execute large numbers of collision avoidance maneuvers. Portugal-based Neuraspace is focused on this and has raised a significant amount of money already to build their AI-based platform. COO Chiara Manfletti is our guest this week. Enjoy.
My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by Nano Avionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with the CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu.
And just some final things before we start the episode about ourselves. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. If you want us help expand our work, you can do so and support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast, and we'll also put that link in the episode notes. And lastly, you can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Hey, space enthusiasts. Welcome back to another episode of the Space Business Podcast. It's another episode on space situational awareness, and it's with the Portuguese startup Neuraspace. And very happy to have their CEO, Chiara Manfletti, here today. Welcome, Chiara.
Thanks. Happy to be with you.
Cool. So why don't we start as always, and may I ask you to give us the elevator pitch on Neuraspace, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So Neuraspace is a startup indeed. We exist since about 2.5 years, and what we do is space traffic management. We've raised about 28 million already in public and private funds. And what we have is a software as a service solution for addressing space traffic management. So basically what we do is we ingest conjunction data messages and other sources of data. We issue warnings for operators, and if there is a potential conjunction which is of high risk, then we automatically generate a maneuvering advice for operators. So what we do is we basically bring AI and data fusion and automation to the problem of space traffic management to ensure that operations remains a sustainable and profitable business.
Okay, cool. And so let's take a step back. So in the intro, I used space situational awareness, and maybe that wasn't entirely correct, use space traffic management. But just because this is meant to be sort of a non-technical podcast, do you mind sort of like parsing this or like telling this apart, how you view this for our listeners, sort of like what are the differences, if any, between SSA, then there's also space domain awareness, which is sometimes used, and then you mentioned space, many abbreviations, many acronyms.
Yes. And that's the worst part of it, so many acronyms. So you'll hear people talk about actually space safety, then you'll hear them talk about space domain awareness, space situational awareness, space surveillance and tracking, which is SST, and space traffic management. They all pertain to basically the field of wanting to maintain space sustainable. The easiest difference that I make is space situational awareness is about being aware. You're not really doing anything. Space surveillance and tracking, you're actually surveying and you're tracking something. So you're actually using sensors to track objects in space, and that's where you use optical sensors on ground or radars, or upcoming also sensors in orbit. And then space traffic management, some people call it also space traffic coordination. There's so many variations, so many colors of the whole thing, is the idea that if there's objects in orbit, the traffic, so to say, that is there needs to be managed. The idea here is that you want to avoid collision. And space domain awareness is just an even broader topic where it can include many other things. Space situational awareness generally considers debris as well as space weather. You could also bring near Earth objects or NEOs in there. So the wider you go with a field, the more you encompass, then the broader it gets.
Gotcha. And I think sometimes I've heard that space domain awareness, to take the last one, that the military community likes to use it because, like you're saying, it doesn't have to be space debris or inactive satellites. It could be like an active enemy adversary satellites and things like that. But so correct me if I'm wrong, but one kind of necessarily builds on the other, right? I mean, you cannot do space traffic management if you're not aware of what's going on, obviously, right? So that's sort of the...
Yes, absolutely, right. So as we, as the company also grows, we also refine the way we talk about also, for example, the services that we offer. And we talk about obviously our space traffic management offering, but we also have a space situational awareness offering or data as a service offering, where of course we have data that we can present to customers, and this includes space weather. But yes, they all connect with one another, and you absolutely need that data, that information from which you need to gather the insight. Of course, the key is not just having data, the key is being able to understand that data. So it's a whole process, it's a whole chain.
And so we're going to get to sort of specifically what you guys are doing at Neuraspace, but sort of just staying on the, the broader market, so to say, or the broader topic and issue for a few minutes. I mean, in your view, now that you're spending sort of most of your time on this, how far along are we in terms of understanding, what's going on in the orbits? And I'm asking this, I could use like a very current anecdote. I think a few days before we're recording this, suddenly a not small piece of a rocket washed up on an Australian beach.
Yeah, I saw
and
that.
It's like nobody, and this isn't the first time this has happened, right? Nobody was like, oh, well, where did this come from? What kind of rocket is this? Yeah. And it seems like there's relatively big pieces of junk falling from the sky, and we don't actually seem to be aware. So this is, for me, as sort of I'm not a layperson, but call it a relative layperson, that seems to suggest that there's still like pretty big gaps in the awareness. I mean, how do you see that?
Absolutely right. Sometimes when I'm sort of taking the whole subject a bit more jokingly, I do actually say ignorance is bliss, because indeed we're not fully aware of what's up there, and there's big objects. I think those we can track, and we should have a clear view of what they are and where they are. But there's many small objects that we're still very much not aware of, and these small objects are dangerous in and of themselves, not because they're just the highest relative velocities that you can get here in space are like 15 kilometers a second, right? So this is pretty fast. So even something really tiny, if it hits something critical, it just can knock out a satellite. But if you're also a smaller satellite, and we have seen trends towards smaller satellites, and obviously the probability of something hitting a vital organ in a smaller satellite is also larger. We're not far yet. I can tell you again, with space traffic management, in theory, you could rely on other companies that are sort of generating that data, and you could very easily just say, okay, I'm not going to generate any data of my own. I will buy data from others, or I will partner with these other entities. But the value chain of data isn't established yet, just like space traffic management isn't fully established. So there's still a lot to do that needs to be done on, throughout the entire spectrum, and get the market up and running as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this, because the way I understood your business model is that you guys are ingesting other people's data and processing it in value-added ways.
Yes.
So that seems to suggest that you are, because there's obviously some companies which take different approaches, some companies which just produce data, and some companies which are, let's call it, vertically integrated. And so the fact that you guys have chosen the approach of being, let's call it like a downstream player in that sense, right? It seems to suggest that you are, more or less happy with the data you can obtain from other sources. But then it sounds like you're not 100% happy, that there's some gaps still.
No, I can't say that we are happy. We are making the best out of the data that is available. But we, from our side, we've recognized that there isn't a single source of data that can give you complete clarity, right? If you look at the types of sensors, you have optical, you have radar, you have laser tracking, and then people are putting piezoelectric sensors in orbit to look at the micro debris environment and micrometeoroid environment. There's people that are putting optical sensors in space. There's event cameras that are coming up, star trackers, all these different types of sensors, and the data that they can produce, they're all complementary. And no one, and I mean, obviously a company that's invested in sensors will tell you that their sensors is great, but no one can really tell you that a single set of data or a single sensor can provide you the best insight. It's only when you put these together that you can actually get the best possible insight into the entire situational awareness spectrum. And that's why we've decided that data fusion is key. Having said this, I would be lying lying if I didn't tell you that we are investing a little bit of our own infrastructure, just because the data market isn't established yet. But I also see that there's a responsibility in industry to actually stimulate the relationships between the different companies and the different parts of the entire value chain, right? So if now Neuraspace goes off and sets up its own complete set of infrastructure, then I don't necessarily need to buy as much data. So I think that there's also a need to, see specialized players in the different parts of the entire value chain. And so we're doing a bit of both.
And so on the data side, just to stay on that for a minute, it kind of brings up at least another couple of questions for me. One is all of the data that's being produced actually available to somebody like you? And I'm asking this because, like, for example, in Earth observation, we know that some companies are very, rigid around basically wanting to own the data and like use it themselves and not give anybody. And I don't know how that is in SSA. So that's
it's the same.
Okay.
It's definitely the same. And part of this is, companies trying to establish themselves as global players. That's part of it. I think in space traffic management or in SSA and SDA in let's say the space safety domain in general, as the market isn't fully established, I think companies are also trying to understand, how can they really establish themselves as a global leader? Who's going to be doing what? How will the market shape up? And so, if you will, there's an additional uncertainty in terms of what the market really is for which part of the entire. Is it, as you were saying before, is it wise to verticalize? Is it better to go transversal? And so I think that some of the companies are more careful when they partner or sell their data or don't sell their data, because they don't know how to distinguish friend from foe, because they don't know necessarily where they want to be going themselves. And I think that's what we're also seeing, which, as I said, makes it slightly different to just the EO market that you were mentioning. So it's similar, but there's also this added thing of the market not being there yet completely.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about the data that is available, and let's just assume it is sort of freely available about these issues. You mentioned there's different sensor types like, optical and radar. And I think at the moment, still most of it is on the ground, but now some companies are talking about taking sensors into orbit. But is there any sort of like, obvious gaps of something that you like, oh, I really wish this existed and I could get my hands on that data?
Well, as I was saying before, we'd like to get data from all types of sensors, really, because they're complementary. No, I mean, at this stage, as I said, we're partnering with different companies that are looking in star trackers and optical sensors in orbit or optical. I just wish they were all a lot further down in their developments at this stage. So I can only tell them to move faster.
Yeah. Understood. Okay, so let's assume I'm a potential customer of yours now. Actually, no, let's take a step back. Well, who are your customers? Is it mostly constellation operators, or is it also other people? Like I could also potentially imagine, I guess, governments for the raw data, or
So
I don't know where insurance companies stand on this today.
Yeah. So absolutely right. Satellite operators are our primary or target group number one for sure as customers. But there's a couple of other groups, if you will. You've certainly named them. Regulator, policymakers can certainly be one of them. Insurance companies I see as a group. We could talk about that in a second. But we've also had some interactions with, let's say, for example, new space propulsion companies that are planning to, develop new propulsion systems, and they want to see that their propulsion systems are space traffic management or collision avoidance maneuvering capable. And so they come and they want to sort of get requirements for us or potentially partner up. And it's actually been quite interesting to see how over the past year and a half, this whole space traffic management has moved from something that was, very much not really, it was spoken about, but it's kind of traveled throughout the entire value chain, from sort of the operators moving upstream to the satellite manufacturers. It's quite interesting.
So at the end of the day, though, of course, the customers have to be aware of the product and then willing to pay for it. Where are we in terms of like market adoption right now? If your average constellation operators, and I appreciate there's probably a very large bandwidth, sort of like how conscious are they of this issue, and how much are they coming to people like you, and how much do you have to proactively go out there and say, look, this is really important. You're going to have an issue. Like you want to have collision warnings.
Well, I guess the answer to this question is twofold, right? On the one hand, of course, as we in Neuraspace have become more let's say, known as a brand. People have started coming to us rather than us having to just chase everyone, of course. So it's a bit of both at the moment, right? You go out and you hunt for customers, but the customers equally come and hunt for you and look for you. In terms of awareness, it's actually quite interesting that there's different levels of awareness or willingness to talk about this entire issue of collision avoidance, depending on the type of player. So is it a new space company? Is it an established player? Looking to put new infrastructure in orbit. They were GEO before, now they're in LEO. If you're talking to the technical people, if you're talking to the business people within the companies. So it's very interesting to see that there's very many differences. But I can tell you that I was at the EU conference for space and defense last week. Was it last week in Brussels? And it was supposed to be about space and defense and more general, but I had the feeling that most of the topic was space sustainability, SSA, and STM, which I found quite fascinating because it really feels like the awareness has really accelerated quite fast.
Now, I was going to ask you sort of if there's any sort of feeling you can give us. Let's say I'm a EO constellation operators, and I have some satellites in a low Earth orbit, like a polar orbit. Maybe I have like something, I don't know, like half a dozen satellites. They're like, this typical size, something like 6U or so forth. Like I don't know how to quantify this, but sort of like how much sleep should I lose over it? How about the situation? Like, am I going to be facing like one conjunction warning, like a day, one a week, one a month, like that kind of thing?
Yes. We had made a simulation for a constellation of 250 satellites at an orbital altitude of 700 kilometers. And we had come up with an estimate of 4,000 conjunctions per week, which had a missed distance of under 5 kilometers, which is the current sort of threshold, which is used in industry today as a standard, meaning that you would have 4,000 conjunctions per week. You can divide that by 7 days, and that is your number of conjunctions that you would have to look into as a satellite operator. And that's terrifying, really. That's a huge amount of conjunctions that you'd have to look into to understand, whether they're high risk or low risk, if you want to maneuver, if you don't want to maneuver. And that's the biggest problem is, of course, if you're in LEO, this is a 24/7 job. Meaning that you have to have dedicated people looking into this. And that's, if you will, again, where Neuraspace comes in, because with an automated solution, then you basically have a virtual team member that's kind of processing all of the data and information and is only waking you up when you really have to be involved into making a decision.
So, okay, just to play devil's advocate here for a minute, or maybe to clarify some of these numbers. You mentioned here sort of commonly accepted 5 kilometer, like coming within 5 kilometers. And I assume that's sort of driven by
it's because of the uncertainties, for sure. Yep.
And plus some sort of like, what do you accept as a risk? And I don't know what, like, is there like a number? Is like people accept a 1% risk, or it has to be 0.01%? Because what I also want to get at is like that it seems like those are a lot of, you're right, the number is terrifying. Those are a lot of conjunction warnings. On the other hand, I don't have the exact numbers, but at least today, there are still a lot of smaller satellites up there, which for historical reasons, people didn't put propulsion on. So
no, for sure.
I mean, even if they had a conjunction warnings, there's nothing you could do. I mean, at least if it's two objects, right? And so that would kind of then seem to me, well, why aren't we seeing collisions all of the time? But that isn't happening, right? So
space is still big, which is good for sure. And it's also true that there's a distribution of objects, and there's there's more densely populated regions than others, right? And then if you go lower, then obviously there's decay mechanism, et cetera, et cetera. But you brought up, I think, another important point, which was obviously, and it brings us back to the question that you asked at the beginning: is there a sufficient amount of data? One of the biggest problems that we have today is, of course, the uncertainties linked to where the objects are. You make a measurement and you have to propagate in the future. Obviously, obviously, the error bars also increase, of course, because you have uncertainty, you have space weather, the density of the atmosphere changes, et cetera, right? So if we were to have a higher precision of where the objects are, then, of course, part of this problem would go away. Now, on the one hand, part of the problem would go away, but there's also more objects going into space. So there's different things happening. And that's why, in a sense, it's also an urgent topic to tackle. Not because we're seeing lots of collisions, luckily, knock on wood, happening, but because if we want to actually enable also further growth of space, then we have to actually act early on for two reasons. One is that the actual avoidance of collisions between active satellites, but the other is, of course, making sure that the debris population doesn't get any worse. And that is in of itself a whole topic which needs to be taken seriously. And then we can go back to the actual domain of SSA. And I kind of brought in the word space safety, which then is also about taking down objects of big debris objects, which are, again, the ones that if they fragment or if they break up can, cause huge damage, and then prohibiting anti-satellite tests, making sure that people passivate their satellites, et cetera, et cetera.
Hey, fellow space enthusiasts. This is just a quick 30-second reminder that I just released my introductory space economy book called To Infinity in English. It provides a non-technical introduction to the space sector, covering key trends, key space businesses, humanity's potential future in space, and how you can get involved. All of this is based on my daily experience as a space venture investor and also as a university lecturer on space entrepreneurship. The book is about 250 pages long, and you can get the Kindle version for about $10. You can find it on Amazon, or you can download a free sample at spacebusiness.substack.com. The link is also in the episode notes. Now back to today's episode.
Yeah, I suppose that's then sort of different in the sense that obviously if it's inactive objects, then the conjunction warnings aren't the solution anymore. It has to be, I guess you could still help in the sense that your modeling may be able to indicate which objects make more sense to remove.
Yes, exactly right. For sure. Yeah. That's but we know that we have to take down also the big objects, and of course in and of itself that is a bit of a challenge because they're big, and we know that the rocket equation actually says that you need lots of propellant to take down the big objects, and some of them are in not so good orbits, and et cetera, right? It's I mean this whole conversation becomes very big, especially because if we start talking about really what's sustainable, then I always point also to the graveyard orbits, and for me that's a classic of let's push the problem into the future, and someone will take care of it in the future. But that is a problem waiting to happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess we can open the 2-minute bracket on what is called active debris removal, which we're talking about here. So I guess you believe that there should be some level of active debris removal. And one question that always comes up around this, and I don't know if you have a view on that, is sort of like, well, that's kind of a perfect tragedy of the commons, as we call it in economics. But so like, who is going to pay for this and why? And I'm sure you guys probably have had internal discussions around that. Is there any sort of view on how we could solve that?
Look, I was actually having thoughts about this already when I was back at ESA, because of course, indeed, actually back before we set up the space safety program, debris was basically just seen really as just waste, right? And the idea is, how do you create an economy around waste? But somehow it exists on Earth, not always well, and there's plenty of cities that have problems because there's waste just flying around. And we do have a waste problem on Earth as well. But still, I think that there's all sorts of ways that this could be tackled. And certainly it does involve somehow money, right? So either you put down a deposit, or you have a partnership with a company that will deal with this and do some sort of management of objects in space for you and take the objects down for you, or there's some sort of insurance. I mean, there's multiple ways of going about it, but it's clear that we can't tackle it just by doing things just the way we've done so far, right? So somehow the value chain needs to be expanded with new players and a new equation for the money equation, cost equation, let's call it like that, so that the entire cycle closes. What I'd find actually more interesting for sure is the idea of keeping objects in space, and at some point also doing recycling manufacturing in space. But that's very futuristic. But for me, that's where the story needs to be heading, right? So while we make sure that we do fleet management, we take away debris, I think that there needs to be also preparations for more sustainable solutions, because we already know today that just re-entering objects into the atmosphere may not be the most sustainable approach ever. I mean, most basic is there's precious metals also on board and precious materials. We're really going to burn them up when there's a lack of resources on Earth. Point number one. Point number two is, of course, the atmosphere is going to be impacted if there's too many particles in the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. So, but that's a huge topic in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of, I guess, getting towards a what we call a circular economy in space. And there's one or two startups actually working on that. The challenge, and we should really invite one of them onto the podcast. The challenge there, of course, is again sort of closing the economics without government subsidies. But coming back to your product, so your sort of, let's call it the bread and butter product. I'm a constellation operator. I sign up, and let's talk a little just briefly about your business model. Is it like as simple as is it like a subscription per satellite, or how should I envision that?
It's a subscription per satellite per year. It's as simple as that. And you have then full access to the platform. And in the platform, you would see your assets that you've uploaded with your settings that you've chosen. You were talking about risk your risk tolerances, if you have specific settings for that. If you have a fleet or if you have individual assets or group of assets, you would see that. And then you would see, conjunctions coming in, information coming in, are the analysis that we've made, predictions that we make about one of the things that we've been working on is machine learning model for predicting the evolution of the uncertainties of the objects over time, so that operators can understand, am I going to get better quality data? Can I make a decision already today, like 4 or 5 days in advance prior to time of closest approach? Should I, be looking into additional data sources? And then maneuvering advice, as I was saying, based again on settings or preferences and your type of service, right? So just to give you an example, if you're like a telecommunication operator, you may not want to do your maneuvers over New York at time of high intensity broadcasts, and you decide that you actually set up that you want to do maneuvers over the Pacific. If you're an Earth observation satellite provider, then you have other settings that are more interesting to you, and we provide maneuvering advice and then follow through.
I assume this is mostly a LEO thing, right?
LEO, MEO, and GEO is an interesting debate. And that's what I was saying. It's very interesting depending on who you talk to. Because if you talk to GEO operators, there's many that believe that, they've been around in space for many, many years. And, some of them find it even challenging to talk to startups because, they're the titans of space and startups are like the juniors, right? So, whether this is correct or not, I'll leave uncommented, but
yeah, fair enough. And so the other question I always have is, so let's say there is a conjunction warning, right? So like a risk of a collision, and it's actually between two active satellites, right? And let's assume both have propulsion. How do you decide who's going to move out of the way? Because moving out of the way costs money, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah, it is. I always say that the best maneuver is the maneuver that you don't have to do. So in a sense, I see ourselves as providing the advice of not having to maneuver. And that's why, having good insight into what the situation actually is the most important part of the entire business, really. So obviously, if you're two active satellites, then of course there needs to be some coordination. And we know that today it's very hard, even sometimes for operators to contact one another. Having the right contact. Sometimes it's just info@companyname.com or whatever. So to actually approach them is very hard. So one of the things that we're working on and we're going to issue is a way for active satellite, so operators of active satellites, of course, to actually coordinate between themselves and globally together find the optimal maneuver, or have an exchange. Really, we can provide advice on what the best maneuver would be. But I think that this is where kind of rules of the road would be helpful, right? So, but then again, it becomes very hard because if it's not sort of imposed, then will each and every operator then follow these rules of the road, so that they have to be, I think, technically reasonable and be also have business intelligence to them, right? So there were some rules of the road that were sort of brought out or proposed, where, for example, the newer, more advanced satellite should maneuver over the older, less advanced satellite. one could argue, yes, it's true, right? Or you could look into it and say, okay, if the maneuvering of one of the satellite will put at risk that the satellite will not be able to have enough propellant to then do deorbiting, then maybe it should not, right? So in a sense, it also takes, it requires a bit of an assessment of what the actual risk is. But here the difficulty lies in the fact that risk is probability times impact. And how do you actually assess that impact, right? So obviously we have our own thoughts on how we could assess impact, but that becomes a very wide topic. Impact should be the impact on the operator, but and on the assets of the operator, but then it also should be the impact on the wider environment. And so, leave it to engineers to make it to find the complexity and find the devil in the details. And but so one has to start small and then work towards complexity, I think.
Yeah. I'm just imagining sort of some orbital version of this, this funny situation we sometimes have on Earth when you're like on a narrow sidewalk and a person comes head on, and then you move to the right, but then the person moves to the left, and you do this like 5 times, and then you still collide in the end. That probably doesn't happen in orbit because there's a lot of space, but it sort of seems like it would be good to have it was certainly good to have some rules. Well, I guess another solution would be, but I'm assuming we're like even further away from that, but you tell me if there was some sort of automated, because right now it seems like all of this goes back to Earth, basically, right? And then it seems relatively manual too, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, you're perfectly right. And that's actually part of the vision that we have, or, I personally believe in autonomous spacecraft a lot more for a number of reasons, right? Because as a human shouldn't always need to be in the loop, and sometimes a human can't be in the loop. So it'd certainly be good if there's some autonomy for a number of reasons. And this sort of targets both civil or commercial applications as well as certainly defense applications. Right. So if we had some level of minimum communication between spacecraft, that know where the others are and somehow can coordinate between themselves, that it makes sense already if you have big constellations. If you're a constellation operator, it totally makes sense for you to do so for your own constellation. So why not for everything else? Obviously, there's still going to be those people that want to put satellites in orbit that nobody knows where they are. It's a bit like AIS and ships, right? They have the beacon, beep, 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 beep. You can turn it off and then you kind of disappear, right? But there's a technical baseline for making that happen.
Yeah, but I assume that's of course, there's going to be military assets, of course, but we probably have the same thing in aviation. There's going to be occasionally, military jets flying around, which you don't know that they're until like the last minute, and they tell you to just get out of the way.
Yeah, and that's this brings actually up another important point. There's actually, many people believe that the way to tackle space traffic management is like air traffic management. You should actually have single points that coordinate the space traffic, and are really controllers, if you will. So it's the space traffic control even more. I'm not sure I agree with that because I believe physics different. There's people that are also suggesting that we should have a maximum number of satellites in orbit. So I'm careful there because regulation, it takes ages to come up with regulation. And if you come up with a regulation that's too stringent, then you kind of have to go back, and it takes you another 20 years to change it back. And so I believe more in incentives rather than regulation.
Yeah, I think I'm very much with you right now, because that seemed to be, and I must admit, I don't actually know enough about the history of air traffic management. Obviously it seems to work now, but it probably took many decades to develop. That wouldn't surprise me. And like you said, it just seems different, right? Because air traffic management, even a jet aircraft, even if you're over a small country, you're going to be there probably for a few minutes, where you're in a low Earth orbit, you're like 90 minutes around the entire Earth. How are you going to coordinate this? And I guess also the geopolitical situation today is such that any sort of agreement may be quite difficult. And it seems, I think what you're getting at is we leave it to game theory, and nobody wants to see their spacecraft destroyed. So let's figure this out.
Yeah. So, people generally ask also in panels, if we feel that there is a need for regulation, and obviously the answer is yes, because regulation is good. It shouldn't be over-regulating. Regulation is not good, but regulation is good, of course. And now I always add the statement that I believe that technological advances are generally faster than regulation. So that's why, again, I repeat the fact that I think that also industry needs to take leadership, both from a point of view of companies that want to make sure that they can have a sustained business in space and that their business can continue in the next 10, 20 years because the situation hasn't deteriorated. But also other companies like Neuraspace trying to push for technical solutions that can actually facilitate this and enable this from happening. And, this provides, I think, a technical basis and technically inform regulations that are then put in place, right, by showing how rules of the road can actually be done, because they've already been done, because industry's taken a positive leadership role in this. So maybe I'm too positive and I'm naive in this, but that's the way I see it.
Yeah, me too. And so speaking of incentives, like 10, 20 minutes ago, we briefly mentioned insurance companies as another stakeholder. And of course, their incentive probably should be that they don't want to pay out like hundreds of millions of dollars because satellites randomly got destroyed. But we talked about the traction you have with constellation operators. Any sort of, traction with insurance companies? So
we speak to insurance companies and we get different messages actually from insurance companies. There's insurance companies that say, okay, if the situation doesn't improve and things don't get better regulated and nothing's done, then in sort of 10 years, then space business is not going to be profitable anymore, and we're actually going to leave the space business. I think one of the things that also needs to be said is that many insurance companies, space is like a super tiny part of a much wider business that they have, right? So you're also talking to people that are very interested in insurance companies, but their voice in the bigger company is relatively small in a sense, because the business is just much tinier. And if you talk to this range of insurance companies, you'll see those that tell you, look, there's hardly any impact because the collision impact on the premium that we're calculating is hardly there. So actually, if there's a satellite operator that has a collision avoidance solution in place, then it will hardly get felt. But we did have a conversation with an interested customer recently, and they actually told us that insurance company told them that they would get a better premium and if they had an STM solution on board. So something's obviously moving, at least with some insurance companies. And as I said, we do speak to them, and it's a flirting at a distance relationship at this stage.
Yeah. And so let me ask you another sort of related question, I guess, to incentives is, so right now, commercial customers can sign up for your service. They pay. It's a commercial model. Because, this seems like something where obviously the more people do it, the better it's going to be, right? And in terms of optimizing the overall outcome, right, for the entire ecosystem. So do you think that ultimately this should be like some sort of public service? And then, of course, it doesn't mean that you as a company can't exist, right? Because we have some countries like, for maybe I think UK and Canada, where air traffic management is actually outsourced to private companies.
This is a very interesting debate that's actually ongoing. I don't know how much you or listeners know about USST and obviously equivalent in the US. But of course, there's a conversation ongoing both in the US and in Europe and maybe in other countries as well, as to what would be a public provided service, which is free of charge, available to anyone, and what would a commercial service look like that people then have to pay for. And there's sort of a common understanding that there can be like let's call it a baseline service, which is not the most basic, because basic is it's not considered a nice word, but it's called a fundamental or baseline service indeed, that comes from the public sector, and that there's added value products which are built on top of that. One of the common examples is, for example, conjunction data messages. So conjunction data messages are generated when you have a catalog of objects, and then you basically compare all the objects that are all versus all, and then you see, is there actually a conjunction that's going to come up, right? And then if there is, then a conjunction data message is generated. And that's kind of the most fundamental service that you can provide to someone. And then you can add layers on top of that. So I think that the understanding that protecting space and space is a common good, and therefore the public sector should do something or has a right to do so, and it's good that they feel a responsibility to do so. I think we shouldn't question that, and I think that's good. Also, we all know that in space, the public sector is also very important with investments and enabling, and I see actually their role in providing this fundamental service is something that can actually enable companies to grow. We as Neuraspace, we've actually pushed for the ingestion of conjunction data messages, not just from Space Track, but also from USST. And this is something, it's a process that now we're going through, and it's the first time that this is happening, if you will, which is fantastic, because it means now that also European space companies can rely on USST for developing these added value products. So my answer to you is yes, and the but also comes that there's a limited amount of funding. And if we want to do serious business in space, then if we just limit ourselves to what the public sector can do, then we can sort of not all go home, but we will remain limited. And I think the vision of what space can do for economies and what it can be as itself of an economy is seriously limited. So,
yeah, fair enough. So roughly how many satellites, if you can talk about how many satellites are you having as customers?
So we have 10 customers that are using our platform, and these customers will be putting in orbit about 400 satellites in the coming years. They don't have these 400 satellites now, but they're going to put about 400 satellites into orbit in the coming years.
Gotcha. And of course, your model, by definition, is a very scalable one. But what I want to get at is sort of like if you look 5 or 10 years, whatever the right time frame out, sort of like and kind of taking a lot of these things we talked about now, the future of SSA and space traffic management, what do you guys want the company to be in like a medium term time frame? What's the underlying vision?
Well, certainly when I talk to investors, I always tell them that this space traffic management, the product that we're developing today, is the beginning of the Neuraspace story, really. And as we move forward, being part of making autonomous spacecraft happen is certainly one of the things that we want to be doing, right? So, putting intelligence to orbit, making operations more autonomous, and there's obviously possible facets to this, but that's sort of where we want to be going.
Gotcha. And as you mentioned at the beginning, you guys have raised actually quite a significant amount of, given the age of the company, quite a significant amount of money between private and public sources. You are a downstream company, so if you were upstream, right, some of these guys who want to build like SSA sensors in orbit, then of course we understand this is going to be very expensive at times. But you guys have raised a lot of money. If you can talk about it, where's most of it going through? Is it sort of like commercial development? Is it product development? You mentioned you guys may do something on the hardware side after all.
Yeah. So we are, as I mentioned, we are investing in a little bit of infrastructure because as the sort of data value chain isn't fully developed, it's actually good to have. And I think in any case, it's not bad to have your own sort of independent data sources, and you could play around with it and experiment with new models, also of analyses, et cetera, et cetera. So most of it indeed is going into product development and investigating sort of new methods. And as I said, we have these 3 pillars, which are data fusion, AI, and machine learning, and automation. And so most of our funding goes towards people and working towards product development for sure. But data and this infrastructure is obviously the second bigger portion of what we're investing in. Yes.
Are you guys hiring right now?
Yeah, we're hiring. We grew from, we were 4 or 5 in November of last year, and we're 26 now. So we don't have these huge jumps, and then sort of we're sustainably growing slowly but steadily, unstoppable.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, as we're sort of winding down towards the end here, a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. So besides Neuraspace, so first of all, actually Neuraspace is based in Portugal. I would argue you're one of the most prominent, maybe the most prominent space company in Portugal right now.
Yes.
And in a recent previous life, you were also, I think for a short time, the head of Portugal-based, the Portuguese space agency. Just want to talk a few minutes about how you see the Portuguese space ecosystem.
So obviously I have different views of the Portuguese space ecosystem. I can share maybe the anecdote, of course, that being the first president of the Portuguese National Space Agency, one of the things that I was very adamant about was indeed trying to push for a new space, and new space meaning bringing in private investments into space and doing so also in Portugal. So for me, going out and then leading Neuraspace was also, you don't just preach, you actually do it, right? So, and showing that it's possible. Now, one of the things I've always found extremely fascinating about the Portuguese space ecosystem is that there's many companies that aren't just in space. There are companies that are in space and in aerospace or in sort of different fields, right? And I found that always a strength, because, one of the things I believe is that space needs to stop being a bubble. So companies that understand and other markets and experience the space market, I think, can actually bring positive experiences and positive influence to also the space market. So I've seen this Portuguese space ecosystem, tiny, compact, but with advantages which we don't necessarily see in other countries where companies are very specialized around space, because there's huge amount of public sector funding.
Yeah.
So they're they can be more, they can just survive longer and better on public sector funding. So that's that's I think the highlight, and then the one big takeaway that I've always seen in Portugal.
Yeah, fair enough. And so I forgot to ask you, how did you originally get involved with Neuraspace? What attracted you? How did that happen?
It's actually a funny story, which I'm more than happy to share. So I went to Portugal Space because at the time Portugal was wanted to set up the agency, and they were looking for someone with a sort of European background. So I got asked by the government to go, and then talking to the director general at the time, I was then seconded. I sort of was on hold from ESA and went off to Portugal to help them do this. For me, it was a wonderful honor. And when I was there, one of the things that I told the government was, space, Portugal doesn't have that much public sector funding. We just spoke about it, right? And Portugal can be a leader, right? One doesn't have to restrict oneself to just being a component provider or doing technology development. But in order to lead, of course, you have to identify new markets and then invest in those. And then you can grow the champions of tomorrow, the leaders of tomorrow. And I always say, it's thoughts that move the world before it's money that is moving the world. And so I convinced the government to invest in space safety at the time, because I really believe that this was an upcoming market. And I really believe that we would see commercialization in space safety happen a lot faster than, we'd seen in other sectors like Earth observation, telecommunications, where of course it's happened, but at a different speed. And I think that's happening. So one day, a guy called Nuno Sebastião walks into my office. I didn't know Nuno at all. He's, in the tech world in Portugal, he's quite known. And he tells me, okay, hello, I'm Nuno. I'm like, okay, good. It's nice to meet you, Nuno. And he started asking me whether, I believed that space debris was a thing. Nuno had worked for ESA previously, and then he had left ESA, went off and created a company called Sci, which does AI and machine learning for fraud detection for financial entities, especially banks. And Sci is a unicorn. One must know that's unicorn, but I didn't know any of that. So he had been contacted from some former colleagues that said to me, why don't you give back to space? Why don't you, create a company in space? So he was doing his due diligence and trying to understand whether space debris was a market that he could invest in. So after our conversation, he was, I think, positively convinced that this was the case. He probably did some more due diligence, and then he created Neuraspace. He actually founded the company. And after I left Portugal, and after I then decided that I was also going to leave ESA, he contacted me and he asked me if I wanted to join and lead the team. And, it was space debris, space safety, important topic. And, I knew that having Nuno as an investor and someone I could turn to for advice within the company, to bring forward the company was certainly, with his background of having built and set up a company, was certainly going to give Neuraspace starting DNA, which many other startups didn't have. So that's how it happened.
Yes, that's a good story, and very serendipitous, right? Because of course also the Feeds AI expertise in artificial intelligence is very beneficial to what you're doing at Neuraspace.
Yes.
So and obviously it was on a personal level, like you pointed out, you already were interested in space safety. May I ask you if you weren't at Neuraspace, but obviously you have a good overview of the space ecosystem in general, is there any other sort of area of new space, of commercial space business you find very interesting and attractive right now?
Well, my background is propulsion. I'm going to say the my background is space propulsion. So I find extremely fascinating to see what's going to happen in the field of space transportation and, specifically in Europe. So, I find that just interesting because where access to space remains one of the key enablers, right? And there's been a lot of change, lots of evolution, revolution, and I think we're going to see more. So I'm very excited about that.
Very interesting topic. And as even the ESA Director General recently very openly pointed out, in Europe right now, we have to do some work so we can ensure our space access.
Yeah.
Let me ask you
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think we have quite a number of micro launcher companies that want to prove their worth. And, if we're lucky, we're going to have quite a few that are going to launch successfully. And then, we just have to take our pick on which ones we're going to buy services from. I know it's not that easy, but, yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you a final question, which is always the same, which is about science fiction. Assuming you like science fiction.
I do.
What are some of your favorites? It could be anything: books, movies, TV shows.
Yeah. So I've avidly read Heinlein, Farmer in the Sky, and his books. But I have to say, I also got hooked. I mean, I'm a total Trekkie fan, but I also got hooked on a series called Firefly, which was kind of a total mix between like a Western style and science fiction. Really, really like that.
Yeah, Firefly is good. That's almost, I think, 20 years ago now, but it still has this cult status.
It does. And I was devastated. I discovered it late. I was devastated when I found out that they only had that one go at it.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, well, thank you so much. We'll be all watching what's happening in the world of space traffic management, SSA, SDA, whatever you want to call it. It's an important topic, and it's good people like Neuraspace that are working on it. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.